plant-based, low-carbohydrate diet on body weight and blood lipids in hyperlipidemic adults. So before I start, I just have a few disclosures. I received a number of training grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And before I begin, I want to say that this work was not only my work, it was a group effort, and this is work that was from my PhD dissertation. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. David Jenkins at the University of Toronto, and the whole research team, as well as the funding support for the work I'm going to be presenting. So as we all are aware, we currently have an obesity epidemic, and as a result, there has been tremendous nutrition research looking at the optimal diet for weight reduction, particularly with regards to the macronutrient composition. So one such diet that has been very popular and still remains popular is the high-protein, low-carbohydrate Atkins types diet. And most of these diets recommend high protein from animal sources and has been primarily recommended for weight reduction. And it has been shown to increase HDL cholesterol, decrease triglycerides, and have no change on LDL cholesterol. And part of the reasons for both the weight reduction and improvements in serum lipids is related to the calorie restriction as well as the macronutrient composition. However, there has been concern raised with regards to the increased intake of animal protein, and with that, increases in saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, especially in the absence of weight loss with regards to increasing blood lipids. In the study by Gardner and colleagues published in JAMA in 2007, they actually compared 4 different diets that differ in macronutrient composition on weight reduction as well as blood lipids. So the 4 diets were the Zone diet. So the Zone has moderate carbohydrate, the Learn diet, which is higher in carbohydrate and based on national guidelines, the Ornish diet, which is very high in carbohydrate, and the Atkins diet, which is very low in carbohydrate. So looking at the mean change in weight over the 12-month intervention period, we see that the Atkins diet significantly reduced body weight relative to the other 3 diets. However, if we look at the changes in LDL cholesterol, we see a different story. So here we have the change in LDL from baseline, again, over the 12-month intervention period. We see that the 3 diets, the Zone, the Learn, and the Ornish, all decreased LDL at the 2-month mark, versus the Atkins diet actually slightly increased LDL cholesterol. However, these results did not persist over the 12-month period. And this is consistent with other research that has looked at low-carbohydrate diets in relation to LDL cholesterol. Most of the short-term studies have shown an increase in LDL, but in the longer-term studies, there tends to be no change in LDL. But as you see here in these studies, there hasn't been a study that has shown decreases in LDL. So either it's increases or no change. In more epidemiological studies, so this is a nurses' health study where they looked at the low-carbohydrate diet score in relation to risk of coronary heart disease. So the low-carbohydrate diet score, so the higher the score means the higher the amount of fat, higher amount of protein, and the lower amount of carbohydrate. And they also separated the sources of from animal protein and animal fat. So those are the dark bars you see, versus vegetable sources of protein and fat, which is the gray bars. And when someone has higher intake of vegetable protein, vegetable fat, and lower carbohydrates, so this end here, there was a significant reduction in the relative risk of coronary heart disease by 30% compared to lower vegetable fat, lower vegetable protein, and higher carbohydrate. This effect was not seen with animal sources of fat and protein, so the dark bar here. So when you have higher intakes of animal fat and animal protein and lower carbohydrate, there's no change in the relative risk of coronary heart disease compared to those who have lower animal fat and protein, which suggests that vegetable sources of protein and fat may be relevant and important in reducing the risk of coronary heart disease. So this leads us to sort of what we were interested in. Rather than a low-carbohydrate diet that's based on animal sources of protein and fat, what about focusing on plant-based, so vegetable sources? So we replaced the animal protein with vegetable protein, mainly coming from soy, gluten, and nuts. We replaced the animal fat with vegetable oil, so coming from tree nuts, avocado, olive, and canola oil, high in monounsaturated fat, while promoting weight loss. So the objective of this study was to assess the effectiveness of a low-carbohydrate, high-protein, plant-based diet on body weight and blood lipids under first metabolic conditions. So we mean that all foods were provided to participants, and then in real-world conditions. So real world is ad libitum, where they actually had to get their foods themselves, and we didn't provide any. So both the components of the metabolic phase and the real-world conditions have been published. So if you want more details, you can refer to these publications. The metabolic phase was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2009, and the ad libitum results were published earlier this year in the British Medical Journal Open. So the study was a two-phase randomized controlled parallel study. So participants were either randomized to a high-carbohydrate National Cholesterol Education Program control diet or a low-carbohydrate, high-protein, plant-based diet. So the metabolic phase consisted of 1 month or 4 weeks. So again, all the foods were provided to participants, and they were only given 60% of their energy requirements to induce weight reduction. Participants continued on their diet for another 6 months. This is the ad libitum phase, where we didn't provide any of the foods, but they had to get it from their own supermarket and follow the recommendations we provided. And again, we're recommending the 60% energy reduction during this ad libitum phase as well. So this shows you an idea of the macronutrient composition of the two diets, so the high carbohydrate and the low carbohydrate. And this is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. So we see that the protein represented 16% of the energy on the high carbohydrate versus 30% on the low carbohydrate. The amount of carbohydrate in the high carbohydrate was 58% versus 26%, and the energy from fat was 25% versus 43%. And on the low carbohydrate diet, much of the fat came from MUFAs. To give you an idea how this translates into actual food and what was provided to participants, this gives you kind of an idea of the foods that were provided. So on the high carbohydrate control diet, we provided non-viscous fibers, so coming from whole wheat bread, bran flakes, wheat crackers, and various vegetable sources. Whereas on the low carbohydrate plant-based diet, we use viscous fibers, so coming from oat bran cereal, barley, eggplant, okra. Protein sources from the high carbohydrate came mainly from dairy and egg protein, versus plant sources of protein on the low carbohydrate, so soy and gluten. And other sources of carbohydrate were provided on the high carbohydrate diet, like noodles and pasta, whereas other sources of foods that were higher in fat and vegetable fat and vegetable protein were provided mainly coming from nuts. So in this study, 50 overweight hyperlipidemic subjects were randomized with a mean age of 57, with a BMI of 31, and a baseline LDL cholesterol of 4.1. So this is probably a little difficult to see in the back, but just to give you an idea, we screened over 400 individuals, and we randomized 50. 25 allocated to the control, 25 to the test. Today, for the purpose of the presentation, I'm going to be presenting those who completed the metabolic phase, so 44 out of the 50, and also all those who started the ad libitum phase, which was 39 individuals. So first, the 4-week metabolic phase. So first, looking at the nutrient profiles during the metabolic phase, both groups had a reduction in caloric intake. So again, we were only providing 60% of their energy requirements, so this is expected, and there's no difference between the two groups. There was a very high compliance on the energy intake, so about 94 to 95%. And the available carbohydrate was achieved based on what we predicted and provided to participants. So there was a lower carbohydrate on the low carbohydrate, higher protein, and higher fat. So first, looking at the changes in body weight, as expected, there was a significant reduction in body weight in both groups, and there was an identical amount of weight loss during the 4-week metabolic phase. So basically, the lines were identical, achieving about a 5% reduction over the 4 weeks, with no difference between the two groups. What's interesting is the differences we saw in serum lipids. So here we have percentage change from baseline on the x-axis and the 4-week intervention in this repeats. So we have LDL, total cholesterol to HDL ratio, apolipoprotein B, and the apolipoprotein B to A ratio. So in all these graphs, you see there was a significant reduction in these outcomes on the low carbohydrate diet compared to the high carbohydrate diet. So you see it with LDL, the ratio, ApoB for the low carbohydrate, and the ratio as well. And this same pattern was seen when we looked at triglycerides. So again, a significant reduction in triglycerides on the low-carbohydrate diet compared to the high-carbohydrate. Now looking at the 6-month ad libitum phase results. So similarly, we did get similar results in terms of the nutrient profiles. So again, participants were able to maintain a calorie reduction during the 6-month ad libitum phase, again, with a slightly greater reduction on the low carbohydrate compared to the high. They maintained a greater reduction in percent energy of carbohydrates on the low carbohydrate, higher protein, and higher fat percentage. And they were able to maintain about 1/3 of these components as compared to the metabolic phase. So we looked at the amount of viscous fiber, vegetable protein, and nuts they were consuming on their own. Okay, looking at the body weight results. So here we have change from baseline. So this first 4 weeks is similar to what I showed in the metabolic phase. And the new data here is from the 4 weeks on to 28. So this is a 6-month ad libitum phase. So as you can see, whether they were on high carbohydrate or low carbohydrate, they continued to reduce their weight. But there was a greater reduction in body weight on the low carbohydrate compared to the high carbohydrate. So the end was just over 8 kilos versus about 6 kilos on the high carbohydrate. Again, looking at the serum lipids, so we have LDL, total cholesterol to HDL ratio, ApoB, and ApoA. And again, this is the first 4 weeks of the metabolic phase that I just showed. So we see that those who are on the low carbohydrate diet maintained a significant reduction in these outcomes compared to the high carbohydrate diet. Although the amount of reduction was not as great as during the metabolic phase because we provided all the foods, but they were still able to maintain a reduction. So the low carbohydrate diet individuals were able to maintain a reduction in LDL compared to back to baseline on the high carbohydrate. Again, will translate into improvement in the total cholesterol to HDL ratio. Again, low carbohydrate had a greater reduction in ApoB, and in turn, the ratio. So the next step in terms of this study is really to continue to test these two types of diets and for a longer duration in a larger sample size. We also are interested in examining some more surrogate markers of CVD in addition to just risk factors, and really a focus on strategies to increase and to maintain adherence in real-world conditions. We noticed that there was a greater reduction in the metabolic phase, but not necessarily sustained as much during the ad libitum phase. And this is really important in terms of a cholesterol-lowering perspective because many of the foods that we used in the low-carbohydrate diet do bear US FDA health claims for CVD health reduction. And also to collaborate with food industry in addressing some of the concerns of availability of these foods, variety of these foods, as well as ease of food preparation. So in conclusion, under metabolic conditions, a low-carbohydrate, plant-based diet improved the blood lipid profile compared to a conventional high-carbohydrate diet despite similar weight reductions. And under the real-world conditions, so the ad libitum phase, a self-selected low-carbohydrate plant-based diet resulted in a modestly greater body weight reduction and a sustained and favorable blood lipid profile compared to the high-carbohydrate diet. And finally, this low-carbohydrate plant-based diet may be considered another dietary option or alternative for treatment of hyperlipidemia and obesity. Thank you.
I don't know exactly, but it seems like there's less, food choices for that group specifically. So could you tell me something about that?
Yes, that's a very great question. And that's what we found between the two phases of the study, because in the metabolic phase, we gave all the foods. So it's easy that they don't have to shop for it. It's already in their house. When we went to the ad libitum phase, that was one of the challenges that we found, so that, one, they have to go buy it themselves, and the amount of variation, because the metabolic phase was only 4 weeks. The ad libitum was 6 months. So most people can eat the same foods for 4 weeks and can kind of just bear with it. When you look at the 6 months, they like variety. And that's where one of our objectives is really to work with food industry to have more variety in plant-based foods so it's available, easy to prepare, so they're more likely to comply with it. So that's the challenges with doing sort of real-world conditions when you're limited by the supply in the food industry. But that's a great point. So hopefully an increase in plant-based foods will help with this type of diet.
Very quick.
Yeah.
Julia, thank you very much. Your volunteers, were any of them vegan or vegetarian to start with?
No.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yes.
Clears that one up.
Yeah.
And why involve gluten?
Sorry?
Why involve gluten? There's so many gluten.
Yes. Well, we conducted this study probably not when the height of the kind of the gluten-free diet right now. We included gluten because there's only limited sources of plant protein that are highly concentrated. We did use nuts, but that comes with fat as well too. There's only so much soy we can provide. So the next one was gluten, which was the higher protein. So that's the challenges as the last question of getting plant protein in high amounts. And that's why we chose gluten. Yeah. Yes.
You may know the term whole food.
Yes.
It's used quite frequently by industry and also by academia. So how does the outcome of your study support or not support the concept of whole food?
I think our study supports the concept of whole foods, using a whole food approach in terms of achieving active components. So whether it's soy protein, whether it's higher MUFA or higher antioxidants, kind of a whole food approach gives you all those components without trying to figure out which components are active ones, what's the dosage, what's the form. So I think this approach supports the whole food because you're getting a whole variety of bioactive components. Okay, thank you.